Everybody, my name is Steve Warner, and I've spoken here before as well, and I'm going to introduce Steve. But I want to give all you students some really good advice. Always try to find somebody smarter than you, to bring on board, and that's what I did, because even though I've lectured here before, now I've helped bring Steve Radelet here to speak today about his newest book, called The Great Surge, The Ascent of the Developing World. And Steve and his wife Carrie and I all served in the Peace Corps, like Dave did here. And so that's how we initially knew each other. But Steve is one of the very top international development experts in the world, not just the U.S. And I'll just touch on some of the highlights of his career. Steve holds the Donald F. McHenry Chair in Human Global Development and is Director of the Global Human Development Program at Georgetown. So he's a professor, doctor at Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. He also serves as an economic advisor to President Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, President of Liberia, and he's a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution. Steve previously was the chief economist at USAID. He also was the deputy assistant secretary at the Department of Treasury, which has responsibilities for looking at economic issues all over the world. So he was responsible, I believe, for Africa and Europe, right? Africa and Asia, okay. And he was also a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development, which is a think tank that looks at big global development issues and changes in the world. He also worked as an advisor to Secretary Clinton when she was Secretary of State, so he worked at the State Department responsible for global development issues. So he's got a rich background. He'll touch on his work as an advisor to the government of Indonesia. I mentioned that Steve was a Peace Corps volunteer. Steve and Carrie served as volunteers in Western Samoa, and there is a Peace Corps alumni network, so that's partly how we know each other. Steve's wife, just to give you a little more background, is the current Peace Corps director, and she's in Africa right now, so she couldn't be here with them. But he comes to Denver because their daughter, Megan, lives here. Megan's a student at CU Boulder in the Lead School of Business, and they have a son, Sam, who works in Silicon Valley. Steve and Carrie have done a lot in their careers. They both have very rich global development backgrounds. Steve has written several books. Again, this book is the most current, but he's also written Emerging Africa, How 17 Countries Are Leading the Way, and he's written a textbook, The Economics of Development. His undergraduate degree is from Central Michigan. He has advanced degrees and master's and PhD from Harvard. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Steve. Thanks.
Thank you. I wish you had been around when my mother was alive and you could have introduced me to her. She would have been quite impressed. Anyway, thank you, Steve. I appreciate it very much. And thanks, everybody, for coming out. You're probably going to see most of my back, although I'll try to swing around. But there seems to be a lack of symmetry, I suppose.
Yeah.
See. Anyway. Thanks for coming out. There is a widespread perception in the world that, with a few exceptions, most developing countries are stuck. There's not much progress, development efforts fail, foreign aid doesn't work, and that outside of China and India and maybe a couple of other countries, most countries are stuck with very little income growth, very little progress in health and education, living under dictatorships, and not much hope for progress. That story may have at one point have been true, but it is completely wrong. And I'm here to kind of disabuse you of that notion a little bit. Instead, the facts are that we are living in an era of the greatest progress amongst the global poor in human history. Period. There's actually no doubt about it. In the last 25 years, there has been more progress for hundreds of millions of people in dozens of developing countries around the world than at any time in human history. And by progress, I mean almost any dimension of progress that you care to look at, whether it's poverty reduction, growth in income, improvements in health, improvements in education, the spread of democracy, reductions in conflict and war, yes, reductions and the spread of democracy and improvements in civil rights and liberties. Global hunger has been cut in half. Millions more people have access to water and sanitation, and the list goes on. I have been, this has been in the back of my mind for many, many years, and I've been frustrated, frankly, that as this progress is unfolding, and while the data is really quite clear, that the story has never really been told. For a variety of reasons, partly because the press always likes negative stories, partly because human beings, I think, are attracted to negative stories, and partly because academics and other specialists specialize and know a lot about their one area of expertise and not about other areas of expertise. But for a variety of reasons, we are in this process of some of the greatest achievements in human history, and almost nobody is aware of them. And that's the purpose of the topic of my book. And so what I want to do today is kind of give you a snapshot, a big overview of this story, starting with some of the data, not all of it, but some of it, to show you some of the basic data on what's happening with global poverty, with income growth in developing countries, some health indicators, education, democracy, conflict, just to give you a feel for some of the tremendous progress that's underway. I'll take a few minutes and describe why I think it happened, what happened to launch this surge of progress in the 1980s and especially in the 1990s. Talk a little bit about the future. And we'll do that and then leave some time for some questions. So let me start with some basic data. What I'm going to do is just do a couple of slides on poverty, and then on income, and then on health and education. Just go through a couple of snapshots of some basic slides of very, very different aspects of development. This is a graph of poverty, the number of people living in extreme poverty, actually going back as best we can to 1820. I want to put this in some broad historical context. These are the best estimates we have of the number of people in the world living on incomes less than $1 a day, in constant prices, as best we can, back over 200 years. And they come from two different data sources. One, a piece of work done by Francois Bourguignon and Christian Morrison that goes all the way back to 1820, a heroic piece of research that brings us up to around 1990. And then that's when their work ended, and then coupled with more recent work from the World Bank. That's why those two lines are there. But they tell a similar story. And the basic idea of this is as follows. Up until very recently, the vast majority of people in the world lived in what we would now consider abject poverty. Almost everybody, with a few exceptions, if you go back a few hundred years ago, lived in horrible conditions, at least what we would consider horrible conditions now. Many children died young. Most people did not live very long. Nobody went to school. Everybody was illiterate. They lived in lousy housing with mud walls and thatch roofs. They couldn't keep the water out, and the rats were in and all. They couldn't get decent nutrition, would not be well fed, would barely get one meal, much less 2 or 3 meals a day, and were living under dictatorships of one form or another, monarchies or imperialist systems around the world. So basically had very few human rights, basic rights. And that was really the story for almost everybody up until just a couple of hundred years ago. This estimate here suggests that in 1820, 900 million people in the world were living under $1 a day. Global population at that point was 1 billion people. It was 900 million out of a billion. 90% of the world's population were living under $1 a day. People have looked at these numbers, quibble a little bit about whether it was 85% or 95%, but it was within that range. Almost everybody was living under $1 a day. If you happen to be a king or queen or related to them, or one of the few people that own large tracts of land, you were fine, but otherwise, it wasn't so good. The point of that is that throughout human history, as global population increased, the number of people living in really severe poverty increased with global population. That has been the trend since the beginning of human history. And that number rose and rose and rose along with global population. After the Industrial Revolution, the number grew more slowly. Actually, the percentage started to fall because people in Western Europe and later in the United States, New Zealand, and Australia would begin to rise out of poverty. But still, the total number began to continue to rise alongside global population. After World War II, starting in the mid-1940s, for the first time ever, the number began to level off. And then, in the 1980s and 1990s, for the first time ever, the number fell. And it fell, it didn't just fall a little, it fell a lot. And in 20 years, the number of people living in poverty fell by half. After rising from the beginning of human history, the number of people living in absolute poverty, in extreme poverty, has fallen by half in 2 decades. Nothing like this has ever happened before in human history. Now, let's look a little bit, zero in on the last few years. I'm now switching from $1 a day, which is the data that we have over history, to $1.90 a day, which is the World Bank's most recent data release on poverty reduction. It's their newest poverty line. These data are about a month old, and they come from hundreds of household surveys around the world from developing countries themselves. It's not the World Bank's data. The World Bank aggregates it and puts it together. So this is very new data. The red line is the number of people living under $1.90 a day, corresponding to the axis on the left. The blue line is the percentage of people in developing countries living under $1.90 a day, using the right axis. On the red line, you can see that 2 billion people were living under $1.90 a day up until 1993. You can see the last part of that leveling off, that level trend that we saw in the last slide after World War II. Starting in 1993, it dropped from 2 billion to less than a billion, actually just about 900 million. In 2 decades, 1 billion people were lifted out of extreme poverty. 1 billion in 20 years. We don't have the numbers yet for 2015. Some people are trying to estimate and extrapolate. By best estimates, we think that number is now down to 700 million, which would mean that it fell from 2 billion to 700 million in 22 years. 1.3 billion people being lifted out of extreme poverty. Nothing like this has ever happened before. A lot of people listen to that and say, oh, well, it's all China. Well, China's a big part of it. Of course it's a big part of it. It's a big country that's made incredible progress. It would be weird if China was not a big part of it. And that's an important part of the story. But China's less than half of this. India is also a big part. But it's actually happening in dozens and dozens of countries around the world. This historical turning point of the number of people living in extreme poverty rising and then turning and then beginning to fall has now occurred in more than 60 developing countries around the world in the last 20 years. This is Mozambique, in Ghana, in Namibia, in South Africa, in Indonesia, and Mongolia, and Sri Lanka, and India, and China, and Bolivia, and Brazil, and Chile, and El Salvador, and the Dominican Republic. This is happening in many, many countries around the world. Not all. I do not want to claim this is everywhere. But in the majority of developing countries, we are seeing a faster reduction in poverty than ever before. So that's income poverty at the most extreme levels. Now, a lot of people ask, if their incomes are now above $1.90 a day, how much? Is it $1.91, $1.95, $2? Big deal. Or is it something more? So I looked at that and looked at the number of people in 1993 and in 2012 with incomes less than $1.90 a day. And you see the drop from 2 billion to 900 million, from 1.9 billion to 900 million. You see the number of people between $1.90 and $3 a day, from $3 to $5 a day, with incomes over $5 a day. When I did this, I had not actually seen anybody do it, and I got the data and did this. I expected that, I knew I was going to see the big drop in the first bar, because that's the same numbers. I expected that I was going to see a big jump in this bar, the number of people living with incomes between $1.90 and $3 a day. But this actually didn't change much. You have more of a rise of people with incomes between $3 and $5 a day, which is almost double, from 750 million to 1.3 billion. Here's the big action. The number of people with incomes more than $5 a day has almost tripled, from 970 million people to 2.7 billion people in the world. So incomes have risen not by a little, but actually by quite a lot amongst the global poor, or at least for many of the global poor. And we now have a situation that's never been the case before. We now, up until this moment, the number of people with incomes under $1.90 a day was always more than the number of people in the world with incomes greater than $5. That has always been the case in human history, that this number was much larger than this number. And for the first time in history, all of a sudden this is flipped, and we have many more people now with incomes greater than $5 a day. Now, I don't want to pretend that $5 a day is some huge, wonderful amount of money, but it is a huge difference from $1.90 a day. It does mean that you can have a cement brick house with a better roof. It does mean that you can get at least 2 meals a day, if not 3. It does mean you can put your children in school. It does mean when you're sick that you can buy medicine. It does mean a lot. It means moving from basic subsistence on the edge of survival to at least a little bit of comfort and a little bit less risk and a little bit not necessarily living hand to mouth. So it is actually a big change in human welfare for quite literally hundreds of millions of people. So that's the poverty numbers and the beginnings of income. Now I'm shifting to income. I'm going to look at income per person, average income per person, GDP per capita, actually, but income per person. And this is an average of the income levels for all developing countries in the world going back to 1960. And they're all in different currencies and all of that, so I took everybody's average income and re-indexed them so that they're all equal to 100 in 1960, so you can just see the pattern of change over time. So this is an index of the level, and so therefore the slope is the economic growth rate. It's the growth in income. And what you can see here is 3 very clear, distinct phases of economic growth over the last 50 years. The first phase, which corresponds to after World War II and then the beginning of independence and the post-colonial period, we had a period of modest economic growth around the world, and many developing countries were beginning to make economic progress. Even under the tutelage of dictators and other problems, there was modest economic growth. But starting in the early to mid-1970s, for 20 years, it stopped. There's a 20-year period from the mid-70s to the mid-90s where average income in all developing countries around the world did not change. 0 economic growth for 20 years. This is a time that started, of course, with the oil crises in the 1970s, which triggered a global recession that affected every country in the world, including the United States and Great Britain and all the European countries and every developing country around the world. It gave rise to the debt crisis. It gave rise to all kinds of economic problems, accentuated by the fact that early experiments in democracy had failed, and almost all developing countries were under dictatorships at the time. There was a lot of conflict, a lot of war, a lot of nasty dictators. This was not a good time at all. And it is now called the lost decade, or decades, or many other things. But it is also the period of time which gave rise to the view that development efforts don't work, that people are stuck in poverty, that they're all under dictators, that are all corrupt, and there's never any progress. It is that 20-year period that still influences what people think is happening in developing countries, but it ended 20 years ago. And a lot of academic research actually reinforces that view, because good academic research looks back over all the data for all the years that we can find, and there's a lot of data over those 20 years which filter all of the results, and people don't pick up the turning point. But there's a very clear turning point here in the mid-90s when incomes began to grow. And in fact, they've doubled over the last 20 years. Average income in developing countries, excluding China, has doubled in the last 20 years. The average income in real terms, after inflation, excluding China, has doubled in the last 20 years. And again, we've never seen that kind of growth for that many countries around the world where so many people are beginning to get economic growth. Something happened there in the early 90s, and you will notice that it is exactly the same time that the poverty numbers began to fall. So the two are obviously quite closely related. And just to make the point that this is not just a China, India, I'm counting countries here. How many countries, developing countries, how many countries looking at the earlier period, the mid-1970s to the mid-1990s, and then since then, how many countries exceeded a modest rate of economic growth, 2% per person? 2% per person when you factor in population growth is GDP growth of 3.5%, 4%. It's pretty good. It's not super. This is not 10% China growth. but it's a pretty good rate. It's actually the historical average rate of the United States. So this is sort of a measure of how many countries have modest economic growth, decent, modest economic growth. In the earlier period, out of 109 countries, only 21, only 1 out of 5 developing countries was even achieving that modest rate of growth. Now it's 71. Something changed in a lot of countries. And now the vast majority of developing countries are now experiencing at least that level of economic growth. How many exceeded 4% per capita, which is actually quite fast. The United States has never achieved economic growth that fast for more than a few years at a time. How many have exceeded that for 20 years? It was 10, now it's 30. It's almost a third of developing countries are growing that fast. And how many countries are going backwards? How many countries had negative growth? In the first period, it was 51 countries out of 109, almost half, which is why average income was unchanged, because half the countries were actually going down. 51 countries for 20 years had negative income growth. Now it's down to 10. So there's still some out there that are struggling. This is Jamaica and Haiti and North Korea and the Central African Republic and Somalia and some countries that get a lot of attention because they're, frankly, a kind of a mess. But they are not the norm now. They are the exceptions. It used to be the norm. Now they're the exceptions. So economic growth is much more widespread. So we see the poverty numbers and the income numbers. That gives rise naturally, okay, what's happening to income distribution? Is it the case that all of this income is simply accruing to the rich? Answer, actually, no, it's not. People want to believe that because we have a problem with income distribution in the United States. It's getting worse, as we're seeing in Europe. And there's a lot of talk about whether there's something systematic in advanced capitalist systems about whether income distribution will get worse. Even Thomas Piketty wrote a famous book recently on this. There's a lot of debate about this. The dynamics in developing countries are entirely different. They're still about countries and people trying to work in agrarian systems, move from agriculture to manufacturing, move from rural systems to urban systems. Those dynamics are completely different from anything going on in the United States. And I only emphasize that to say people make the mistake of assuming that what's happening here must be happening there, but it's an entirely different economic system and process. So what's going on? Well, the bottom line, and I'll show you some data on this, is that the assertion that people make that income distribution is getting worse in developing countries doesn't stand. The opposite is it improving. The data kind of lean that way. I'm not prepared to make that strong assertion, but the data certainly do not support the view that income distribution is getting systematically worse. In many countries, it's actually getting better. Let me show you that two different ways. The first way, here's the thing, actually, before I show you this slide. Here's the thing about income distribution that makes it really difficult, separate from poverty. Poverty, we have a line, absolute line, $1.90 a day. We can argue about the line, but it's an absolute standard. Income distribution is a relative concept. It is comparing one person's income or one group of people's income to someone else. It's comparative. Well, who? Person versus another person, richest versus poorest person. Where's the country relative to another country? Where's it the distribution within a country? Where's it the poorest group of countries and the richest group of countries? They're all measures of income distribution. And they're all perfectly valid. But they're all actually really different. And when people talk about income distribution, it's really important to understand what they're talking about, because there are really different measures of distribution among people, across countries, within countries, across. So there's lots of different measures. So I'm going to show you some that are across countries and then within countries. This is a measure looking at the distribution of the richest countries relative to the poorest countries, not individual people, but countries. So think of it, we got 200 countries in the world. Each one of them has an average income, and we're looking at the distribution of those average incomes of the richest countries to the poorest countries. For the last 200 years, that income distribution between the richest and the poorest countries got worse. We had what was called divergence. The European countries and the United States, the richest countries got richer, and the poorest countries didn't make much progress, and the gap got wider and wider and wider. But that changed in the 1990s. This is what's known as a Gini coefficient that measures income distribution. A higher number means distribution is worse. A lower number means it's better. And I have two measures here of across-country distribution. The red one is when you don't weight the countries. Each country counts the same. So China counts the same as the Gambia, where I used to live. Just count countries. Count them all the same. Big, small, it's just countries, and what's the gap between the richest and the poorest countries. That gap was getting systematically worse. This is still, developing countries not making much progress, the richest countries growing more, and that gap is getting wider. But it does change in 2000, and does begin to get better, again, for the first time ever. But it's actually not the best. So even by that measure, the distribution has been getting better for the last decade or so. But it's not the best measure. The best measure is to count China a whole lot more than you should count the Gambia. And when you do that, that's the blue line. And we see global income distribution by this measure starting to get much better in 1980. It shouldn't be a surprise. 1980 is when China opened up. And China's economy began to progress much faster than ours. And that started this process in some ways of growth. And we had, when you weight China and India, they count for 2.5 billion people, then by that measure, global income distribution is unambiguously getting better and has been for about 30 years. So that's across countries. What about within countries? Here I just count countries. Within countries, how many countries is income distribution getting better, staying about the same, or getting worse? And my measure of income distribution here is the share of GDP earned by the poorest 40%. Okay? If I use the poorest 10% or 20%, I get more or less the same numbers, or Gini coefficient, other measures get the same. But this is the share of GDP, share of income, that is earned by the poorest 40%. So if that share gets higher, income distribution is improving. If that share gets lower, income distribution is worsening. And I got 80 countries, not all of them, but 80 countries when I have data for at least 10 years, so I can look at this over time. And I looked at the first observation and the last observation over time. And out of those 80 countries, 37 developing countries, income distribution is actually improving. The share of income earned by the poorest 40% is actually rising. So we have not only the economic growth that I showed you earlier, but within that economic growth, the share of income going to the poorest is actually rising. That's happening in 37 countries. In 22 countries, the share isn't changing much one way or the other. It's plus or minus 1%. It's not changing very much. And that actually is the most common pattern in some ways. And then in 21 countries, it's getting worse, where we may have income growth or not, but the share of that income that's going to the poorest is actually falling. And those are the ones we need to worry about. And those are ones where income distribution is getting worse. Some of those are big countries. China is actually in that category on the right. India is in the middle. Indonesia is on the left. Brazil is on the left. El Salvador is on the left. A lot of Latin American countries are on the left, partly because their income distribution has been historically so bad, it's finally getting better. Colombia is on the left. But again, I'm not trying to, the takeaway here is not, I'm claiming that global income distribution is getting better. But I am pushing back against the assumption and the assertion that I hear all the time. We know global income distribution is getting worse. No, actually we don't know that. It's getting worse in the United States, but it's actually not at a global level. And by some indications, it's getting better. So that's the distribution of income. Now to health. And this, I don't think, will become so much of a surprise for folks here. This is the under 5 mortality rate for children in developing countries around the world since 1960. In 1960, 22% of children in developing countries died before their 5th birthday. 1 out of 5, more than 1 out of 5, which is actually unbelievable and really hard to imagine, totally unacceptable for anyone. But that was the case, with tens of millions of children just dying completely needlessly every year. It's really an incredible number. But that number has been systematically dropping really since the end of World War II. The data before 1960 is a little bit shaky, but it's been dropping quite sharply. And as you'll see, as you can see from here, not the 1990s, this one actually happened earlier, all the way down to now 5% a couple of years ago, and probably even a little bit lower by now. So we've got a reduction of from 22% to 5%, which means that 17 out of every 100 children that would have died just 50 years ago now live. And we're going to see in a moment they live longer. They don't live in deeper poverty. We've already seen that. They get more education, they're living longer and better lives. Now, you all know at least a little bit about demography, but a lot of people look at this and they say, okay, fine, but that means there's more people on the planet, and this definitely means higher population growth. No, actually, it means lower population growth, because parents are smart. And the pattern across every country that I've ever seen is, and the data to back this up is overwhelming, the research on this, this is one of the strongest levers to actually reduce fertility rates and population growth rates. It takes about a half a generation, but when the death rate for children fall, parents see it and they figure it out, especially by the next generation, and they begin to have fewer children. And so what we see is a generation later, fertility rates falling, and the population growth at first goes up, but then it goes way down fast. And so as this under 5 mortality rate began to fall in the 1960s, global population growth began to fall. And global population growth has been slowing down ever since the late 1960s. Still too high, but it is slowing, and this is one of the big reasons why it's slowing, and the relationship between this and fertility rates. This pattern is different from the poverty numbers and the income numbers in 2 really important ways. One, it started much earlier, as I already mentioned. But second, I mentioned on the poverty and income numbers how most countries are in the game, but a lot of countries are left behind. This is basically universal. The rate of infant death has fallen since 1980 in every single country in the world. Period. The United States, North Korea, Haiti, Central African Republic, Sudan, Somalia, take your pick. Every country for which we have any kind of data, this number has fallen. I do not know of any statistic in economics, politics, sociology, social statistics, social well-being that has changed for the better in every single country in the world, any time in history that this has done it over the last 35 years. I actually think this is one of the greatest achievements in human history. Almost nobody knows about it. It has a lot to do with immunization rates. It has a lot to do with getting oral rehydration therapy to kids with a simple salt sugar solution that costs 5 cents, which stops diarrhea. Diarrhea deaths. Diarrhea killed 5 million kids a year in 1980. 5 million kids. Now we're down to less than 1 million, about 800,000 a year, which is still a complete waste of human life. Kids to die of diarrhea because they can't get salt sugar solution. But it was 5 million, now it's less than 1 million. And a range of childhood diseases have now gone away. So this is a really big deal that almost nobody knows about it. But it's not just childhood disease. This is a measure, this is life expectancy, which captures the broadest measure of health, I suppose. And this is life expectancy at birth on the left, and life expectancy contingent on reaching age 5. So the difference here is this is the expectancy at birth. Contingent on reaching age 5 kind of factors out the under 5 mortality rate that we've already looked at to say, okay, if you make it to age 5, how long would you expect to live? So this is actually picking up later childhood and adult disease rates, mortality rates, is what's basically here. The at-birth life expectancy has increased from 50 years to 65 years. It's increased by 1/3, 1/3 in just a couple of generations. A huge increase in life expectancy. Contingent on reaching age 5, it's grown from 61 years to 68 years. Big jumps in life expectancy. Malaria deaths have been cut in half around the world in the last 15 years. Malaria is the biggest killer in Africa. Deaths have fallen by half in the last 15 years. Tuberculosis infections are down by more than 1/3. HIV/AIDS deaths, HIV/AIDS related deaths, are down by 1/3 since 2005. HIV/AIDS deaths around the world are down by 1/3 in the last 10 years. How many people knew that? You guys are health people. How can we not know this? I didn't know it either until I actually read the WHO, the last report on HIV/AIDS, and there it is. It's like on page 5. I'm like, what? And called some people who dug it up. Oh, yeah. And, it was on page 43 of the Washington Post or something like that. HIV/AIDS deaths are down by 1/3 in the last 10 years. We haven't beaten it by any stretch of the imagination. But that's pretty good, and nobody knows about it. Sorry? No? So that's a pretty good thing. Smallpox eradicated is a big part of this. Polio nearly eradicated. Just disease after disease, there's been enormous progress. It's not over. We have Ebola, we have Zika, we've got all kinds of problems which are big threats. But there has never been this kind of progress in health at a universal level. And the advances that we made, frankly, in the West finally began to spread to the rest of the world after World War II. Education. This is the average years of schooling that an adult has in developing countries. So this is not asking kids, this is not looking at kids in school today, this is asking adults, how many years of schooling did you have? Okay? And we would all say 16, 20, 22. In developing countries, 3, 4, 5. But it's changing. 1970, 1990, 2010. The goal is the number of years of education on average for all adults. The blue is males and the red is female adults. In 1970, the average adult in developing countries had 3.5 years of education. Grade 3, grade 4. That's it on average. Some none. Some a bit more, but 3.5 years of education. Now it's up to 7. In 2010, I'm sure it's higher than that. So the level of education, again, for hundreds of millions of people, has doubled. The biggest change has been for women. There's a gap between men and women, and there's still a gap, but that gap is actually getting smaller. And the biggest increases in the amount of education of women that went from just 2.7 years of education to 6.5 years of education. It's not enough, but it's translating into more people with basic skills. And of course, these are the averages, which means there's more and more people on the upper end that are getting to secondary school or to college, which is translating into a whole range of skills in engineering and in health and all kinds of things that are beginning to translate into greater capacity. And this is one reason why when people ask me if I think this can be sustained, I think, this is good. This will help sustain this progress over time. Girls in particular have seen more advances. This now switches to the percentage of girls in primary school, that complete primary school. So we switch from adults to school-age kids. This is the share of girls that complete primary school in developing countries. And a couple decades ago, it was only 60%. In the 1980s, it leveled off again for about 15 years. And in 2000, it started to rise. And we're now at the point where 90% of girls in developing countries complete primary school. 90%. Still not good enough, but they're catching up. And there's still some countries where there's a big gap. But this gap is closing more and more. And girls are finally getting the educational opportunities that they deserve. This is really important for a lot of reasons. Because we know from lots of research that when you educate a girl, first of all, they have more income earning opportunities themselves. But then they get married later. They have fewer children. There are fewer instances of sexual abuse against women that have more education. Their children are healthier, and their children have a better education and longer education. There's a huge intergenerational effect of girls' education that is actually a bigger intergenerational effect than for boys' education, which actually shouldn't be surprising. Maybe it's not right, but it shouldn't be surprising. But there is a very powerful impact here on girls' education that we're seeing all around the world. So education has changed in a big way. There are big issues about the quality of this education. It's not always very good. The class sizes are too big. The teachers don't always show up. The girls are not always safe on the way to school or in school. So there are lots of questions and a big agenda for greater progress in the next 20 years. But for the first time, girls are at least getting some basic opportunity to go to school that in previous generations they never have. So poverty, income, health, education. Now we're switching to governance, democracy. This is the number of developing countries that can be considered as democracies. There's lots of different definitions of democracy, and I'm happy to unpack the ones I use, but any definition that I've seen, the basic pattern is the same. Democracies were rare in developing countries just a few decades ago. Actually, democracies were rare in the world if you go back 100 years. There weren't very many at all. But in developing countries, there were almost none. And in the 1970s, there were only about 12 democracies out of my database of 109 developing countries that could be considered democracies. India, Costa Rica, Botswana, Mauritius, just a handful of countries. Cape Verde, a couple of small island countries. The number began to grow in the 1980s, and then in the early 1990s, once again, we've got the early 1990s, the number of democracies really jumped in a big way. And now we have almost 60 developing countries are democracies out of 109. It's the slight majority of developing countries that are now considered democracies. Yes, lots of problems. Frail, fragile, corruption, stolen elections, too cozy a relationship between business and government. And no, I'm not talking about the United States government in Washington, D.C. or Washington. There's lots of problems with these democracies. But democracy is hard. And our own history should forewarn us from being too judgmental about the quality of other countries' democracies, because we had more than our share of problems of our famous line of all men are created equal, which meant all white men and all land are created equal. And it's taken us a couple of hundred years to unpack that a little bit, and we're still not there. And we have our share of corruption. My former governor of Virginia was just convicted on 11 counts of corruption. The last 3 governors of Chicago, of Illinois, the last 3 have done jail time. So we can be a little careful before we throw too many rocks. So yeah, they're frail and fragile. 30 years ago, the common wisdom was developing countries couldn't be democracies. A famous theory called modernization theory basically suggested that you had to have a certain level of income before you could develop democratic systems. This throws that right out the window. And once again, never before have we seen this great experiment, which is what it is, of so many countries trying to become democratic with all of its faults and frailties along the way. I don't know actually whether this is going to last. It's frankly, I think, up for grabs at the moment as to where this is going to go. There are some, the number has leveled off, and some countries have gone backwards. Thailand, which was a democracy, has had a couple of coups in the last couple of years. Venezuela has gone the wrong direction in terms of democracy. Russia, some people think it was a democracy. It was probably at least close. It certainly is not a democracy anymore. So countries have gone backwards. But at the same time, in the last couple of years, we've had Myanmar come up with democratic elections. We'll see where that goes. Nigeria last year had very successful elections where an opposition candidate basically outvoted the incumbent, and the incumbent quite graciously stood down. Would have been unheard of during the days of military rule in Nigeria. We've got Indonesia, where I lived for 4 years, and I worked in the Ministry of Finance under the Suharto government. And last year, in 2014, 2 years ago now, a former furniture maker beat Suharto's son-in-law, Major General Prabowo, who was the Major General who led the invasion of East Timor, and he beat him by quite a bit in a free and fair election in 2014. A furniture maker beating Major General Prabowo. If somebody would have told me that in the early 90s that that was going to happen, I would have said, you are insane. But it did. The generals are gone in South Korea. We have a democracy. Taiwan is a democracy. Mongolia is a democracy. Malaysia is pretty close. Sri Lanka's civil war is over, and they're moving towards democracy. Latin America was full of generals 20 years ago. There wasn't a democracy in sight outside of Costa Rica. And now it's all democracies, except for Cuba, Venezuela, and Haiti. But basically, otherwise, there's been this enormous shift away from dictatorships. And a few others we can quibble on the margin, but there is no question there has been an enormous shift. In half of sub-Saharan Africa, Ghana, Senegal, South Africa after the end of apartheid, Zambia, Namibia, Mozambique, Tanzania, Cape Verde, Botswana, Mauritius, all now democracies that were not democracies very long ago. And I'd be happy to talk more about it. With the spread to democracy, there are many fewer wars. And nobody believes this because we all read the papers and we all read about how the world is all coming to an end and there's much more violence and war and how could this happen, and it's all Obama's fault anyway. Sorry, injection there. But this is a count of the number of civil wars in developing countries. At any given time in the 1980s, there were 12 civil wars going on at any given time. Now there are about 6. There's a little bit of an uptick here because of Syria and the Central African Republic in the last couple of years, but there is still far less conflict than ever before. A guy from Harvard, Steven Pinker, has written a terrific book called The Better Angels of Our Natures that documents conflict and violence and war over the last several hundred years around the world. And the data just show time after time after time that we actually live in one of the most recent times in human history in terms of the number of wars, the number of deaths, and the amount of violence around the world. and the data is actually pretty strong. So this is the number of wars. And again, if you think back to the 1980s, every country in Central America was at war. El Salvador and Guatemala and Nicaragua, they were all at war. Not anymore. None. Colombia was fighting the narco guys. Shining Path in Peru. It's all done. There are really no active conflicts in Latin America, which is pretty remarkable. In Asia, we had the aftermath of Vietnam, Cambodia, the killing fields. Indonesia invaded East Timor. Done. There really are no active conflicts in Asia at the moment. Ukraine, whether that's Asia or Eurasia, but with that exception, Asia is a pretty big place, which has been pretty violent for a long time. And there are no active conflicts in Asia at the moment. In sub-Saharan Africa, Southern Africa, was in flames with apartheid. With South Africa, Namibia was what was called Southwest Africa at the time, Mozambique. In Namibia, we had Cuban troops financed by the Soviet Union attacking from Angola, SWAPO, the Southwest African People's Organization, under Jonas Savimbi, remember? Attacking Cuban troops on African soil, attacking South African white troops financed by us, that would be us, fighting this Cold War puppet war on the ground in what is now Namibia. I mean, it's almost bizarre. Big war going on in Mozambique. Western Africa, West Africa, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Guinea were all at war. Charles Taylor was running around chopping people's hands off. It's over. It's over. I don't want to minimize the tragedy in Syria or in the Central African Republic, where many wars that are going on, but there's a lot less of it than there was 30 years ago. And if you go back, obviously, to the 1940s and beyond, those violence numbers goes up. This is another take on it, which is battle deaths, which has fallen by even more, about 75% drop in the number of people killed in active battles in developing countries. Two different data sets, because they cover two different times, but a huge drop in battle deaths. Last slide. I've talked a lot about this great progress, but I want to reinforce the point that this is not everywhere, and that there are many countries and many people that are still left behind. There's still 700 million people that are living under $1.90 a day. There's still 5% of children that are dead before the age of 5. There are still too many girls that don't get into school, and when they do get into school, the quality is lousy. So I want to reinforce that point. So this is back on income, and I said earlier, I showed you that slide that showed how incomes had doubled with the surge of income growth since the 1990s. That red line is the same graph. It's just a slightly different, it's a bigger scale, so it looks flatter. But you can see the 20 years of no growth followed by the increase in incomes since 1995. And what I did was take all these countries and then rank them. The 25 countries that had the fastest economic growth, their average income is the blue line. And the 25 developing countries that had the slowest growth, that's the gold line, just to show the variation around that average. And what we have is the 25 countries with the fastest growth have been absolutely outstanding, unbelievable. This is China and Korea and Taiwan and Malaysia, the East Asian miracle countries, along with a couple of others like Botswana and Mauritius and Costa Rica. In those countries, incomes today are 5 times higher than they were in 1960, in real terms after inflation. So today's citizens in those countries, on average, are 5 times richer than their grandparents. This is hundreds of millions of people. This is a really big deal. Nothing has ever happened like the Industrial Revolution. There was never growth like this in Western Europe and the United States. Never anything like it. But at the same time, the gold line is 25 countries in which there has been no growth. And the average income in those countries today is basically the same as it was 50 years ago. So we live in this world where there's incredible progress juxtaposed against a bunch of countries that are still stuck. So I do not want to create the impression that all is well and that everyone is progressing. But it is true that there's been more progress than ever before. Briefly, what triggered this? The end of the Cold War, globalization, the spread of technologies are 3 of the big powerful engines here behind this. The end of the Cold War led to a dramatic fall in violence, and the end of these puppet wars in Central America and in West Africa and in South Africa and in Southeast Asia. They were all hot wars. There were proxy wars for the United States and the Soviet Union going at it. When the Cold War ended, that stopped. But at the same time that violence ended, ideas changed, and there was a big sweep towards the legitimization of democratic governance and a movement towards more market-oriented economic systems. Not free markets, not at all, but away from, and nor should it be, but away from strong, heavy-handed state intervention in the economy and more towards just giving people the opportunity to create their own business and their own economic opportunities. And I show in the book how a range of economic policies changed and a range of how political openness changed. But ideas were changing, and that's the really powerful engine away from the old fights and ideas into a new set of ideas. So the end of the Cold War had a lot to do with it, which corresponded with the emergence of China, by the way, which was a big part of this. But there was also global integration, and with global integration, the spread of technology. And by global integration, I mean stronger trade links, stronger financial links, stronger information flows, the internet, but also the spread of technology. And technology doesn't spread in the absence of globalization. The single best example of globalization at its best, and there are examples of it at its worst, but at its best is vaccines. You cannot get vaccines from GlaxoSmithKline, where they manufacture them, to a little village in northern Mozambique without the best of global integration, without private companies working with UN agencies, working with USAID, working with national governments in Mozambique, local governments, and people at the clinic, and the community health worker who actually lines up the kids and gives them the vaccine. And you can't make that work without everybody working together and linking the global system. And that is globalization at its best. In 1980, 20 million kids were getting vaccinated. Now it's 200 million getting vaccinated. And it's also foreign aid at its best. But there are also other global linkages in trade and finance. They're very controversial, but the evidence is very clear that on net, while these have created some losers and some hardships, they've created far more winners and created far more economic opportunities for the poor in developing countries, which is why that income is growing and why the poverty numbers are falling, is because the poor are getting much greater economic opportunities in agriculture and manufacturing and services. Lots of questions about whether this can be sustained, but given the time, let me stop here. And I'm happy to answer questions about what has happened, why it's happened, but also or about foreign aid, or roll it forward. So I talked too long, so I'll stop right there. Yes, please.
So for the 25 slowest growing countries, do you have any ideas why they're not growing?
So these countries have a couple of different characteristics, three, and at least two of them are interrelated. One that's not only partially interrelated is they tend to be more geographically isolated. They're landlocked, and they tend to be landlocked deserts. Mali, Burkina Faso, Afghanistan, which is a landlocked desert. It's not a sand desert, it's a rock desert, it's a mountain desert. And when a country is a landlocked desert, it precludes them from taking advantage of moving in terms of agricultural production, because they're a desert. And it precludes them from opening up and integrating with trade, because they're landlocked, and they're not integrated with the global economy. So a lot of these are geographically isolated that way. But they have two other characteristics. Much more conflict in these countries, and they're all run by dictators. There are no democracies in that group, that's for sure. So poor governance, lots of conflict, and landlocked. And at least the dictatorship and the conflicts are related to each other. So you've got very few economic opportunities and people going to war, and most people suffering as a result of that.
Is Zimbabwe one of those?
Zimbabwe is one of those. Yep, where you have all three, landlocked and pretty bad governance and a lot of conflict. Yes.
I can authenticate, and I have one question. I can authenticate what you're saying. I'm from India, so when I was a lecturer in medical college in 1970, my salary was $10 a month.
$10 a month?
Yes, I was happy.
King. Yeah.
But now, the same post is $500.
Oh.
And the servant maid at that time was being paid $1 a month. She's being paid about $60 a month.
And some of that's inflation, but not
yes, definitely. There's the salaries have increased about 18 to 20% a year.
Right.
The other observation is whether these people are really happy getting the type of money is another question. Because as the income rises, their aspirations increase, desires increase. So the happiness quotient may be inversely proportional.
It's not
maybe.
Right. So two good questions. First, just a comment on your point about the salaries. When incomes grow, like they have, that means that governments are able to collect more taxes. Even if the tax rate doesn't go up, if GDP goes up by 50%, if your tax rate is the same, your tax take is going to go up by 50%. And that's what has happened in developing countries around the world, which means they can finance higher salaries for people. They can start to improve their healthcare systems, which have a long way to go, but they're beginning to improve, which means they can invest in infrastructure, which means they can invest in schools. And we're beginning to see that. So that's one of the reasons why those salaries have gone up. There's been a lot of work on happiness quotients, and the bottom line is that as with most of these indicators, not just income, but as health improves and education and incomes improves, happiness measures tend to go up slightly, not as much. They don't go up quite as quickly, partly for the reason that that you point out, that aspirations grow, and partly if we just think about our own economy, you know, we're pretty rich and pretty well off, and a lot of people aren't very happy, which is a complicated story. But there is work on the happiness quotients. But nevertheless, you know, I still think that even if happiness is not going up quite as quickly, the fact that fewer children are dying and people are moving away from poverty is a pretty big deal, even if their happiness quotient is not going up quite as quickly.
Definitely, you know, like the children of my maid, they are computer literate.
Boom.
And they are having very, very good jobs.
Right.
So she basically retired at age 45.
Did she really?
Yes.
There you go.
Because her children are doing so well. She
Right.
says, I don't need your job, but if you want me, I'll come and volunteer here.
This is the intergenerational impact of the power of women that can do this.
Yes.
And this is playing out with millions and millions of people around the world. Thank you. Yes.
I had the opportunity to study with Paul Farmer for a while at Harvard School.
Yeah.
One of his concerns was that Gates Foundation, Clinton Foundation, that everybody's sort of tripping over each other. There's a lot of duplication.
Paul was concerned about that? That's where he gets all his money.
That was what
I shouldn't
that was
say
the gist of
He just wants more.
that was the gist of a month-long
I
course
love
that I took
Paul.
with
Is the
him.
same.
But so he was concerned about sort of the architecture of
It's
all
true.
this. But it actually corresponds. I mean, those, and also an increase in NGOs. All around 2000,
Yeah.
and that's when these income.
Yeah,
these
so
incomes
it's
are
really,
rising.
it's a very astute observation, and it's right, and it's getting complicated. So, putting aside the question of whether aid is effective, and I'm happy to talk about that, and the bottom line is that with a lot of variation, yes, it is effective, especially on health, but also on other aspects, but that wasn't really your question. The aid architecture has gotten far more complex. So if you go back 40 years ago, we had the U.S. government, we had the World Bank, we had the Rockefeller Foundation, we had the Ford Foundation. The UK had a small aid program, and that was about it. Then the regional development banks, the African Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and then most European countries developed their own aid program. Germany's came on much later, you know, it took them a while after World War II. So now we have all the Europeans individually, plus the European Union. So it got more complicated that way. But then, starting around 2000, we've had this explosion of foundations, which is pretty directly related to the dot-com boom. So Bill Gates, you know, got his money from Microsoft. And Gates was reading in the mid-90s the World Bank World Development Report on health, and was shocked to find the number of children who died before their 5th birthday. It was that under 5 mortality rate. It absolutely blew his mind, and the numbers around immunizations. And here's why. An immunization, a vaccine, is a technology. Bill Gates had operated his whole life, I've actually heard him give this talk, operated his whole life around technology, and the assumption that if you develop the technology, yeah, you have to do a little bit of marketing, but if it's a good product, it will spread. People will use it. We have this technology, vaccines, cheap, undeniably great for people. And hundreds of millions of people around the world weren't getting it. And it was completely different from his model of the world. How could we have such an effective and cheap vaccine technology, and we weren't getting it to people? And it changed, you know, it blew his mind. And so that's how he got it, that's how he decided. He decided to start the Gates Foundation, and that's why they focus so much on health. But that's where he made his money. George Soros jumps in on the open society side, on the rights base, in the early 1990s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, using his money. So those are the two first big philanthropists. We had Ford and Rockefeller for a while, but then these two jumped in, and now we've got the Hewlett Foundation, the Patrick Foundation, and the Clintons who get their money from various sources, who knows, and all the other foundations that have jumped in, and they're all trying to do great work. But it's hard and it's complicated. And I can tell you, working with President Sirleaf in Liberia, one of the hardest things was for her, how do I manage these people? I have people showing up every day that want to help. They want to do something. And they've got their $2 million or their $5 million. And they all want to see me, the president of Liberia, because they all want to be assured that their money will be used well. But I don't have time to meet with all these people. And so it's actually a challenge for developing countries of how to manage that. So without getting too much into the details, it is a challenge going forward. But overall, the impact has been positive, despite everybody tripping over each other. Other questions? Yes.
What do you think will help or hinder the closure of the gap in many of these development countries?
Depends on which ones. Because the answer is a little different.
Well, for
Are you
us,
talking about income or health?
I'm curious about health and income as drivers.
Yeah.
Other things.
So income is a driver, but you know, I didn't say this explicitly, but implicitly, we saw the improvements of health coming long before the improvements of income. So one of the old ideas about development, which unfortunately some people still push, is that it's all about economic growth, and if you get the growth going, then education and health will follow. And there's something to that. It's true that if you can grow incomes, then you have more tax base and you can pay for those things. But one of the really interesting things about the improvements in health and education here is that they preceded income. So it's not just the income. That has a lot to do with technologies and foreign aid. So how do we continue to close the gap on health? A couple of things come to mind. There's no doubt that technology is a big part of it. And if we're going to fight Ebola or Zika or whatever comes next, or stop antimicrobial resistance from continuing to grow, we're going to need to continue to develop new vaccines, new medications, and new antibiotics. Because I forget the numbers, but there's a very few number of antibiotics that are still really effective in terms of resistance growing. So we're going to need technology. Technology has always been a huge part about progress in health, and that's going to have to continue in the ways ahead, in the years ahead. But it also has to be coupled with continued economic growth, so that countries have more and more financial resources that they can devote to their health systems, as India has begun to do and others as well. And that's going to have to continue so that we can build better clinics and have better trained x-ray technicians and nurses and doctors and have x-ray facilities and then have electricity that you can actually plug this stuff in and refrigerators that can keep stuff cold. So economic growth is going to be a part of it. And then big investments in skills and in education that will help on education in and of itself, but of course will help on health. So you need all of these pieces of income growth, investments in people, and the investments in technology. And that's true in health and in other areas as well, particularly around environment and climate change as well.
Do you think there's a risk for a big disruption?
Yes. Yes, big time. So I didn't say much about the future because I talked too long, and Steve is waving at me because he knows I have another appointment. So I didn't say much about the future. The last third of my book, I don't predict the future. I lay out three possible futures because it's impossible to predict the future. I lay out three possible futures. And I think any of these could happen. One future is that this continues for another 20 or 25 years. With 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards. Some countries go completely backwards because there's some kind of coup, but other countries move forward. But those poverty numbers continue to fall, the income numbers continue to grow, and health continues to improve, and more girls get into school. And I think that is perfectly plausible because we've already got so many girls in school and so much better education, and because countries are financially on stronger footing and have more trained people. But I don't think it's guaranteed. A second scenario is that basically we're done. We're going to stop making progress. It's not going to go backwards, but it's going to level off. The world's leading economies have slowed way down. China is slowing way down. There's all kinds of concerns. What's going to be the engine of growth? We've got Ebola coming from this way, and Zika coming from that way, and disease burdens could continue to bounce back. And it's quite possible that this progress won't disappear, but it will slow way down. And that's entirely possible. And there are a lot of people who believe that's what's going to happen. The third scenario is that it actually goes backwards, and I think this is quite a considerable possibility. And there are a variety of forces that could actually reverse this progress, but two stand out: violence and climate change. And they're actually related to each other.
Violence and
climate change. There's violence growing in the Middle East. There's more and more countries that have nuclear weapons. Somebody could do something stupid. There's all kinds of scenarios that I don't have to explain to you about how the world could go to war. One of them could be the rise of China. One of the most remarkable things about the rise of China is that there has not been conflict with it. But now China's kind of flexing its muscles and it's invading these islands, and somebody could make a stupid mistake. They don't want to go to war. We don't want to go to war. It's in everybody's best interest, but dumb things happen. Just read how World War I started. Dumb things can trigger. Anyway, so violence could bring this back in a big way. The way that violence at a global scale set the world back so far in World War I and World War II. And we're stupid enough that could happen again, for sure. But the other big threat, and in some ways, in my view, the biggest threat is climate change. Because we've been so slow to react and so slow to respond. And the poorest countries of the world that did so little to create the problem are the ones at the front lines that are going to bear the biggest cost, especially those societies that are still so dependent on agriculture. They've made progress. Agricultural productivity is going up. Food production is going up. But with rising temperatures and less fresh water available and smaller plot sizes of land with less fertility, climate change could undo this in a hurry, especially on coastal areas, in places like Dhaka and Bangladesh, where there's more infrequent storms and all of that kind of stuff. We are obviously not making enough progress in fighting climate change. Getting there is going to take efforts both on mitigation and on adaptation. So on the mitigation side, finally, the United States is beginning to take some steps. President Obama announced regulations on emissions controls, and he went to China and negotiated a deal with the Chinese. And it wasn't enough, but you know what? They sat down, the United States and China negotiated a deal on climate change, which is actually a big deal, in November of 2014. And then we had the global conference in December. So we're finally making small steps on the mitigation side. But for developing countries, at least as important is going to be the adaptation side, because they're going to be stuck with rising temperatures and lower fertility, soil fertilities, and less water. And that's going to take building their capacity, but again, it's going to take big investments in technologies. Green Revolution type technologies, we've done it before, but seeds that can grow with less water, that are drought resistant, that can grow in higher temperatures, and we've got some. GMOs are in that strain, and I worry about the anti-GMO movement because there's no science behind it, but they actually, many of the GMO varieties can grow in higher temperatures with less water, and if we move away from that, we're going to be depriving very, very poor people of a source of growing food. So seed technology is a part of it, and then finally, the last part is water technology. Investments in desalination of water are going to be a game changer. Along with, I didn't mention green energy, we'll take that as kind of a given that we all get those investments. But one that is not talked about nearly enough is investments in technology around desalination of water. We got lots of water, plenty of water, but it's all got salt. And I don't know, I'm not a scientist, but that doesn't seem all that complicated to me, but it's expensive. We know how to desalinate water, but it's very expensive. But if we can move that cost curve down on desalinating water, that changes things in a big, big way. In the Middle East, where so much of the conflict is centered on water, in Darfur, which is all about water, raising rights, and many other places where water is a big issue. So, but those could stop all of this. I think that the human race is smart enough and has the resources to make those investments to continue technological progress. I think we've got all the resources we need. I'm not so sure that we're smart enough to do it. And that's what is going to be the future of world sports people.
One more question.
One more. Good, we have time. He's given me a little bit more space.
I was in Africa from 65 to 90. In fact, my
From 1965 to 1990.
And so I was really glad to have this booster dose of optimism. My ex-husband Elon Gilbert worked with you in Gambia, I think.
Oh, really? Oh, Ian Gilbert. Yeah, in the Gambia. That's right. In the early '80s, he was on the Guard project. I actually remember with Josh Posner.
What amazing.
I remember it well.
Last night, PBS had a segment on big data in international or global health decisions, which was excellent.
Oh, you did?
If you want to
Good.
look it up, it's really good. But what surprised me was it was only a few years ago that I realized, at 70, that one of the big problems in education for girls was the menstrual pad. It wasn't the iPad, it was the menstrual pad. And it's only been in the last 10 years or so that women's groups and others have gotten together to do something about this. And I think that's critical. iPads are good, but the others are absolutely critical.
The other pads are even more important. It's really true. You know, one of the biggest barriers to girls going to school is exactly this, their menstrual period. And they didn't feel safe. They didn't feel there was any place they could go. They didn't have the pads. There was no bathrooms that they could use. I mean, how stupid, really, that was preventing girls from getting a basic education. So now that's beginning to change. And along with that, groups within villages are recognizing the threat of violence to girls when they walk to school. So there's more and more, often mothers, but sometimes fathers that will, be the equivalent of a crossing guard, but will walk a couple of miles to school and back to give the girls the opportunity. But those which should be so surmountable are what has prevented so many girls from getting education, and now that's beginning.
There's culture and economics and all that, but the bottom line, I think, so to speak.
There we go. Good. And it is actually, I'll just say one more thing, because I talked a lot about technology, but it's not just new technologies, it's actually the spread of old technologies, if we can call the menstrual pad an old technology. And I mentioned vaccines with Bill Gates. I mean, it was an old tech, it wasn't inventing a new technology, it was actually figuring out the supply chain and how you get it there. And electricity is an old technology. Hundreds of millions of people in developing countries today will go through their entire life without ever having a light bulb in their house. Really? I mean, this is 120 years old, and we still haven't figured out how to get it to people. Piped water is another one. But this is obviously a game changer. Obviously, we've got to move towards different sources of fuel, but this is great. It's jobs for people. It allows kids to read. They go to school. I mean, if you plug in with electricity, it opens up all kinds of economic opportunities. And so just spreading old technologies can really create many, many new economic opportunities. Anyway, thank you very much for coming.